Hey, what's up? Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Roll Pod, an Alabama sports podcast from Bama 247. I'm Cody Goodwin, joined here by Mike Rodak. Just the two of us today to recap Saturday's game, Alabama Vanderbilt. Vandy, surprise winners, 40-35. Alex, a little busy today, which means I have to save my Diego Pavia bragging, I guess, for Tuesday or whenever he pops back into the show. But we are here to discuss an Alabama loss, a stunning Alabama loss. As I said earlier, 40-35 Vanderbilt. Here's a list of the notables, Mike. Vandy was previously 0-60 against AP top 5 teams. They hadn't beaten Alabama since 1984. They hadn't even scored 30 points against Alabama since 1984. And they scored 40 points on Saturday. The last time they did that in 1906 when they scored 78 points. I think football looked a little bit different back then. And this was only the fourth time a number one ranked Alabama team lost to an unranked team in 68 attempts.
And you forgot one, too. It was the first touchdown that Vandy scored against Alabama since 2007. Did you have
Well,
that?
They scored 2 touchdowns in the first quarter. There's a lot to get into when it comes to Alabama's defensive performance. We're going to touch on that, but it's a lengthy list of first time in a long time facts, I suppose, for Vanderbilt coming away with this win. We were there at First Bank Stadium. We're now both back home recording this podcast. But it was a stunner in more ways than one. And as we always do with these instant reaction podcasts, Mike, you and I have talked a lot about this starting last night on the drive home back today. I'm curious your reaction now to this result, kind of what it means big picture, maybe what it means also in the immediacy. Like what's kind of top of mind when you think back on what happened last night in Nashville?
Well, it's all about the playoff. So that was really my first reaction. I think that's where college football is at. You're thinking about what does it mean for the playoff, and obviously the reaction this year is very different than what it would have been last year if this game was plopped down in October of 2023. When you're talking about a 4-team playoff and you have a loss to Vanderbilt on your resume, that is incredibly damaging, much more damaging than a loss to Texas at home was and would have been. So if this loss was last year, this is crippling. This is very bad news for Alabama. The fact that this loss is this year and there's a 12-team playoff makes it much less. I had an editor I used to have that hated this word, impactful. He hated that word, but I'm going to use it here. And it makes less of an impact. So, yeah, the playoff is a big part of it. And I said, look, you can make the argument that Alabama would have been better off losing to Georgia. It depends on whether you value a loss or win more. And, you know, we're probably too early to get too deep into the playoff discussion, but if you had lost to Georgia, a close game at home, I think that would have been forgivable given where Georgia is perceived. And, you know, it would have been bad given how the game unfolded against Georgia if you had lost that game and Ryan Williams didn't score late. But having a close loss to Georgia on your resume, they would have been number one still, is a lot different than having a loss to Vandy. That everybody watched, everybody knew that stadium was mostly Alabama fans. They knew Vandy's not a tough place to play. As much as Vandy tried to kind of mock Nick Saban after the game, I think it was still true. I don't think it was the crowd that got to Alabama. I think it was Vandy and their scheme and their players. So, of course, if you had lost to Georgia, you don't have that Georgia win on your resume. And the opportunities for Alabama to really score a marquee win are dwindling because Missouri doesn't look as good. Tennessee just lost. That will still be a big win if they make it. LSU is kind of LSU this year, and Oklahoma is not as good as we thought. So, there's arguments both ways, but the playoff impact is, I think, marginally worse to lose to Vandy because everybody watched this. Everybody was shocked. There's an embarrassment factor there that comes into play, I think, a lot more than the Georgia loss. So that's part of it. But I think there is still the bigger picture perception of where the program is. Obviously, Kalen DeBoer's in his first year. He went through a lot this offseason in terms of trying to put this roster together. I think the fact that he got Caden Proctor back, or Caden Proctor came back, I don't know if that's a passive verb or not. And then you have Ryan Williams, who you got back, is proving to be incredibly crucial for this team right now, because I don't know where they would be with either one of those players, especially Ryan Williams. So it was a tough offseason, and this was never supposed to be like the year where Alabama went undefeated and looked perfect. But this also wasn't supposed to be the game that Alabama lost. And losing to Vandy, again, comes with that humiliation factor, comes with that embarrassment factor that Vandy has always been the worst program in the SEC. I don't think that's a stretch to say. Even with this team looking better, it's still, as a program and the tradition and all that, is still the worst in the SEC and the least serious, if you will. So that's a problem for Kalen DeBoer in terms of how he's perceived, how his program's being perceived right now, how fans are taking this transition. I think they were a little bit uneasy after that Georgia win. Even despite the win, I think the way the game unfolded and almost losing it made people a little bit uneasy. I think they were uneasy coming out of the South Florida game, even though you storm, whatever it was, 30 points in the last 10 minutes of the game to make the score look a lot better. And so these things are kind of stacking up a little bit. And even though you have that win on your schedule against Georgia, it's still a very uneasy vibe that I think fans have with Kalen DeBoer, especially when they see some of the penalties, the stupid stuff like the illegal numbering that should be very easily fixable. The roughing the passer was borderline, but even, the pick six and the strip sack and all these things just kept adding up over the game, and just you got physically dominated at some points by Vandy. Like, that obviously reflects poorly on the coaching staff and ultimately Kalen DeBoer. That's how it works. So he's going to have to fight that, and I do think some of that is real, just in terms of how he's perceived. But the reality of where Alabama's at is not nearly as bad as it could be if this was not a 12-team playoff season. So that's the other important thing to keep in mind. And that's the end of my roughly 5-minute diatribe.
There's a lot, obviously, off of this tree that we can pick at, and we're going to do our best to try to pick at maybe the most important things today. We'll obviously hear from Kalen DeBoer and the coordinators on Monday. We're recording this on Sunday afternoon. But I wanted to maybe start with just the playoff conversation. I know it's still the first weekend of October, but that was also maybe one of the first things that came to my mind, that, look, this loss, bad as it is, bad as it looks, bad as it's being perceived, and you did a good job writing about that on Bama 247 this morning. Really good story. I suggest people to go look at it. This is not the end of the world. Like, I'm pretty sure, I'm looking out my window right now, the sky did not fall, right? Like, it's bad. Don't get me wrong. And there's a lot of things that are going to maybe have us worried moving forward with specific matchups that Alabama still has to deal with on their schedule. But it's only one loss. We saw that the polls came out this morning before we recorded. They did not even fall out of the top 10. And there's still a lot of opportunity. Like, all of their goals are still out there in front of them. Very similar to the Texas loss last year when they're dealing with a 14 playoff. They lost that game early. It didn't put a fork in their season. Now, it made them have to basically walk a tightrope the rest of the way, and they ultimately did that, and we saw what happened. I think there are similar vibes, maybe not as much do or die vibes, because there's a 12-team playoff. And also, if you looked around the country yesterday, there were a lot of upsets, right? I think 5 of the top 11 teams in last week's poll ended up losing. You do make an important point that the perception of this loss is maybe something that is probably even a little bit lost on me, even though I've been covering the team for the last year and a half. I think I even asked you the question. I'm like, why is the reaction the way it is? It's just one loss. Everything is still in front of them. You did a really good job of just breaking that down, and just, maybe that's me just not really being from SEC country, or really just haven't been, covering the team for as long as I have, or even the sport for that matter.
It's 3 words: because it's Vanderbilt. That's the answer.
I think I understand, but I guess I'm also like, this is maybe the benefit of being an outsider. Like, my initial reaction, I wrote it down here. It's 8 words, not the end of the world, but also that game was not a fluke. Like, that was the other portion of it. And we'll probably get into that a little bit, but I mean, everything is still in front of Alabama right now. They obviously still have a lot to fix, but yeah, I mean, there are a lot of concerning things that I think came out of this game. And maybe that's the easy transition into the game itself. We usually start these instant reaction podcasts with talking about the offense. I prefer to start talking about the defense today, because that was that was the issue on Saturday, right? Alabama allowed 40 points to Vanderbilt, most that they've allowed in more than 100 plus years. Vanderbilt racked up 418 total yards of offense. A lot of that was because of star quarterback Diego Pavia, who accounted for a little bit over 300 total yards of offense, 252 yards passing with 2 touchdowns. He also ran for 56 yards. Vanderbilt with Tim Beck at offensive coordinator and also Jerry Kill, who I think is just kind of a consultant, but you can tell that he has played a pretty big role in the orchestration of this Vanderbilt offense with Pavia. It's a hard offense to stop, right? It's motion-based option offense, and it gives a lot of freedom to Pavia to make reads and make plays. And he did that against this Alabama defense. It was really, really impressive. I think maybe the big stat also, 12 of 18 on third downs. Alabama's third down defense had been very, very good through the first 4 games of the season, right? They had only allowed 11 third down conversions in 64 attempts through the first 4 games. And Vanderbilt surpasses that total in just one game, one afternoon. 12 of 18. One of their stops led to a 4th down try, which resulted in a touchdown. I believe there was another stop that resulted in the illegal numbering penalty that extended the drive. Vanderbilt ultimately turned that into a touchdown. Vanderbilt's offense came out swinging in this game. They scored a touchdown on their first drive, then they capitalized on the tip pass for a pick 6. Vanderbilt's offense ensured that the Commodores never trailed in this game. And that is, I think, why what came to mind was that this was not a fluke. Like, they jumped on Alabama early and they stayed on Alabama early. They had leads of 20-7, 23-7, 30-21, 40-28. They made sure that they were playing ahead, which allowed them to run the ball 50 plus times and control the time of possession battle, which is not usually a thing I pay too much attention to. But when one team holds the ball for 42 minutes, 20 minutes per half, and the other team, Alabama, only has the ball for 17 minutes, that's a pretty big advantage for Vanderbilt. And the offense and the way that they were able to capitalize on early opportunities allowed them to do that. I'm curious, when assessing Alabama's defense and what Vanderbilt was able to do offensively, Mike, usually we do what we like, what we don't like. I'm not sure that there's really a lot that we liked about Alabama's defensive performance on Saturday. Where do you want to begin with this discussion?
Well, I want to begin with, and I'll say this, Alex was not able to join us today, so I'm sure that you would have, given him the Diego Pavia scoop, because you were on that. You've been on that since a while, last year even, I feel like. And so you deserve credit on that one. However, I'm going to have my moment to say, I'm pretty sure on one of the first 2 shows of the year, it might have been after the South Florida game, I was asked to say something nice about Alabama's defense, and I struggled to come up with something. I think I mentioned Jihad Campbell or something, and I was ridiculed and mocked for not having something nice to say about Alabama's defense, because apparently they were the 85 Bears and they just had, all this talent across the board and really good about everything they do. And here we are. So
I don't know that we called them the 85 Bears, but I will give you your credit. You were right to be skeptical and be like, let's see these guys play somebody worth a damn. And they've played 2 offenses that have been worth a damn. And over the last 5 quarters, they have not looked very good at all.
I had a profane rant about, you gotta, I forget what I even mentioned, which game it was. It's probably the LSU game in 2022, Tennessee game in 2022, where it's like everybody thinks they're great for the first month of the season. And then they go to Knoxville and get torn apart. And a couple weeks later, they got torn apart by Jaden Daniels, which as time goes on, that looks a little bit less bad, I guess. But, you just had to wait, I think, a little bit. And I wasn't going to crown their ass for what they did against Western Kentucky or South Florida. And I think what they've looked like in the past 7 quarters, going back to like the second quarter against Georgia, is kind of when it started, is bad. I mean, this is a bad looking defense that, it's one thing to, kind of have this option game kind of feel weird at first, and you got to adjust to it. And that's something that, to his credit, Nick Saban mentioned on College Game Day yesterday morning, that one of his concerns was Alabama playing the option game, because it's not something you practice against very often. But sometimes that happens, and then you kind of just settle in, you figure it out, and you shut it down, because the quarterback in a lot of cases is not able to throw downfield. And that's kind of the factor that usually comes into play. And you even go back to like the Citadel game for Alabama in 2018, which was a scare, if you will. A scare against an FCS team that I'm trying to remember the halftime score. I think it was tied. Like, oh no. yeah, the game was tied 10-10. That was like considered the end of the world for Alabama back then. I wasn't even covering the team, but I was following the team back then. And then Alabama goes on to win 50-17. And so you kind of had the thought that, like, all right, once Vandy got away from its opening script and kind of that opening surge of energy that they had, and Alabama figured out what they were doing, that you're going to have a similar result. Like, you shut it down, you win by 30, 40 points. And that just didn't happen. It just kept going. Every time Vandy got the ball, they kept moving the ball. They kept moving the chains. It wasn't just the option game. I think that's important to point out. I mean, Diego Pavia had 252 passing yards, 2 touchdowns, 16-20. Like, he was good as a passer. And that was, it wasn't just kind of these option throws and stuff. Like, he was throwing down the field, and there was yards left on the board. I mean, that third quarter drive that Vandy had, it was 3rd and 9 from the 50-yard line. He throws down the left sideline. Dude beats the Alabama corner. I forgot who it was.
I believe that was Zabian Brown. Yeah.
Zabian, and then just drops it. And that's a 19-yard line. So that's another.
Right through his hands, too. Like, Pavia dropped that in a bucket.
Right. So that's another 31 yards right there that Pavia probably should have had. And that puts him over 280 for the game right after Carson Beck basically threw for 280 in the fourth quarter against Alabama. So goes back to Nick Saban, kind of said the secondary got exposed, and then you're giving up some of the passing yards that they did to Pavia. So, like, the option game, I think, is part of this conversation, but it was not the whole conversation. Like, Vandy beat them both ways, through the air, and, I mean, they only averaged 3.1 yards a carry.
Right.
It's not as if they were just gashing them like Georgia Southern, shit through a tin horn. Another FCS game at the time. Georgia Southern was FCS when they, the Alabama game and whatever year that was. But people just kind of expect these things to fix themselves over the course of the game, because you're always used to Nick Saban and the defensive adjustments, whether it was Kirby early in his tenure or Jeremy Pruitt. People didn't have quite as much faith in Pete Golding, but guess what? The results were probably better than what we saw in the last couple games. So that's the concerning part to me, that, like, all the good stuff happened early in the Georgia game when everything was new and fresh, and you're working off the crowd and all the energy in that game and all the offensive success. But then once you kind of get into the X's and O's chess match, Alabama got beat in that Georgia game, got beat bad. And then once you get into the X's and O's chess match against Jerry Kill and whatever the offensive staff is at Vandy, like, you got beat again. You got beat by South Florida and Alex Golish and what they were doing. Like, it wasn't a terrible defensive performance, that the offense was having a lot of issues, but that was still not what you're really expecting Alabama to do against a quarterback who cannot throw the ball. So this is starting to stack up a little bit. And I know people are going to harp on, like, the 4-2-5 doesn't work. Look, Nick Saban pretty much ran a 4-2-5 the last few years. Sometimes it was a 3-3-5, but it kind of varied. There are some different responsibilities, different body types. What they have right now in that bandit position with Latham and Overton is going to be a little bit lighter than what you had last year in that third defensive lineman, which was usually Boygby. You're not going to have those 2 pass rushers on the field like you sometimes had, depending on the year and the game, but sometimes you would have Will Anderson and Dallas Turner on the outside. Like, you do not have that. And there is a odd amount of rotation at that wolf spot on the other side between Q Robinson, Keanu Cott, who's been kind of, I don't say useless. That feels like a little bit mean to say, but, like, he's just not showing up in any sort of.
He's not as productive as Rousseau and Q Robinson.
Right. And this is his 4th year now. Like, there's a reason why I think they're kind of going deeper into that Rousseau and Pierre, because, like, they're trying to find something there. And I think that's what Kane will say tomorrow, is that they feel like they have seen good things in practice, but sometimes, as the old adage goes, when you have 4 wolves, you don't have any. So, like, they need that pass rusher, that guy to wreck some of those plays in the backfield. They don't have that. They don't have the defensive lineman who will do that on a consistent basis. Like, Keenan's not bad. James Smith showed up sometimes. Obviously, Otis has been a little bit of a disappointment, which Kane attributed to injury last week. Damon Payne's kind of been in and out, and Tim Smith, I think is inconsistent. That's was kind of the book on him from even Nick Saban talking about him a year or 2 ago. So they don't have that in the front 7 to just wreck all this and blow it up and, put Diego Pavia into the dirt, which is what Alabama fans want. To hear this guy, like, not he's not chirpy. I think, what did Alex say? He's chirpy, but he's not necessarily like over the top, like arrogant.
He doesn't like go out of his way to, for lack of a better phrase, talk shit. But like
Right.
there was a self-confidence about this guy while listening to his media availability in the week leading up to this game, and just having watched him and just some of his mannerisms, and he's a little ornery off the field, right? Like he was the guy that peed on the University of New Mexico logo in their indoor facility, and when that became a thing, and then like a few weeks later, they went into Jordan-Hare and beat Auburn. And so he just kind of became this little mini college football superstar. And so there's
calling him short.
Yeah, he's like barely 6 feet tall. He's listed at 6 feet, and there's just no way he is. Like, trust me. But like he's just there's something different about this guy. And I think that's a little bit of what Kane was referring to last week when he said that, hey, this Vanderbilt team is playing with a little bit of a different energy than they have in years past. And a lot of that, he gave credit to the quarterback for just kind of injecting a little bit of extra juice into this program.
Right. And I think, again, Alabama fans are used to a certain thing. And they expected Alabama's defenders, Jihad or whoever it was, to just put this guy in the dirt and make him feel the pain of Alabama. Like, we're Alabama and you're going to shut up. Like, that's the Ben mentality. And look, it hasn't always been the case. Even throughout the Saban era, you had Zach Calzada, who beat them coming out of nowhere at A&M. You had Steven Garcia, who beat them out of nowhere at South Carolina in 2010 and ended their winning streak. You know, the Calzada one ended the big winning streak too. So you've had kind of lesser quarterbacks, like not 5-star quarterbacks, beat them before. So I don't know if it's like completely different from the Saban era, but that killer instinct to really shut it down and be physical, like, haven't really seen that either. So, and we can get into this as we go on, but like the reaction too, I think, from players is interesting because Malachi Moore reacted in a way that a lot of fans, I think, wanted, in terms of being angry about it. I don't want to say he was in other players' faces, but you know, we all saw him kind of walking around out there and pumping his fists and yelling and screaming. Like,
that was a temper tantrum. Yeah.
Right. And that's what people want. But I think they also don't want sort of the undisciplined play, like kicking the ball in pointless penalty, also meaningless penalty because the game was already over. So like, it's not like it hurt them, but I think it's also, I think DeBoer is right. Like, they don't want to do that. And I think that it's also a bad look for DeBoer in terms of people saying they're undisciplined and loose and all that. You start going down that road. So it's a really interesting kind of pickle that they're in terms of how players react and how people want them to react. And then, you know, people get mad at Tyler Booker for saying that he's going around the locker room and hugging guys and saying he loves them and wants them to hug each other, like, because they think that's too soft. But Malachi Moore is too undisciplined. Like, it's trying to find the right reaction. And, you know, people, again, are kind of used to kind of these old school Alabama players and how they used to do things. And it might be a little bit different. It's as we said it from the start, it's going to look different under Kalen DeBoer and how he wants to run things. And I would not expect him to change based on this loss or, you know, whatever happens going forward. Like, this is the way he does things. And I think he allows certain things that Nick Saban probably wanted to allow, but he also values different things that Nick Saban might not value as much. So it is what it is. You know, the defense, I don't know. Is it fixable? I think is the big question. And I think personnel wise, you have the talent. I mean, in the back end, we've always talked about this all season long. Like, there's more talent in the back end than there is in the front seven, but there's less experience in the back end than there is in the front seven. The front seven is experienced, but not game-wrecking elite players. The back, those guys could be elite players in a year or two, but they aren't right now. And, you know, Malachi's in a 5th year. Sab, I think, has kind of dropped off these last couple of games. It seems like not quite making the same impact to my eye.
Yeah, not nearly as impressive. He was really flying around the first 3 games, and the last 2, I feel like just he hasn't looked like that impact guy that he did early on. And I think that's something he can return to, but that's a good observation too.
And obviously the corners are probably the weak spot of the defense. And obviously the second corner spot is probably more glaring there. So there's different problems based on the level of the defense. And again, how fixable is that? I think experience helps more in the back end. I don't know what helps in the front end, because they're not just going to go pluck a Will Anderson off a tree somewhere and bring him into play the second half of the year. But I still think this defense can be a lot better than what they've shown. I think maybe you get a break in that you don't have to play an option team again until Mercer. I mean, South Carolina is going to have a quarterback run element, but I don't think it's really an option offense like this. I mean, Mercer, I think, would bring that in, if I remember correctly, from a couple of years ago. I can't say I followed their offensive scheme to know if they've changed or not, but like, you're not going to have to worry about that. But it's more than just worrying about that. As I've said, like, Vandy passed the ball, Georgia passed the ball. You have the Tennessee offense to worry about and the wide splits and the tempo. And you have, if he gets a little bit better, that game in Tiger Stadium with Nussmeier, I think, looks a little bit tougher. So, you have some tripping points here. I don't know how much we're going to get into the SEC schedule. I just want to note one thing that has kind of flown under the radar with the SEC. Texas A&M is 3-0 in the SEC. And their win happened early in the day yesterday, so we kind of forgot about it. They beat the top 10 team in Missouri. I kind of use top 10 loosely. Their remaining schedule, they are 3-0 in the SEC. At Mississippi State, home against LSU, at South Carolina, home against New Mexico State, at Auburn, and then the Texas game. So if Texas A&M does not screw it up against Mississippi State, South Carolina, and Auburn, which I think we'll all agree, or both of us will agree, they'll be favored to win those games.
Yeah.
If they don't screw it up against New Mexico State, then it really comes down to the LSU game and the Texas game for them. If you beat LSU at home, which I think is very doable, if Connor Wegman's healthy and Kyle Field is going, then you're talking about an undefeated in the SEC Texas A&M team going up against Texas. And even if A&M loses, you're talking about a one-loss A&M team going up against Georgia, which has one loss already in the SEC, Alabama, which has one loss already in the SEC, Tennessee, which has one loss already in the SEC. Those teams still have to play each other.
Yeah.
Tennessee and Georgia, Alabama.
Ole Miss is still there with one loss. I know that we're not as high on them maybe anymore, but like, they're still in that mix, right, at least right now.
A&M, talk about a sleeper. Like, they have a path to really mess some things up for some people, even if they lose to Texas. If they beat LSU and lose to Texas, they're a one-loss team. You start having to flip through 22 pages of tiebreakers to figure out what the hell is going to happen. And you might have a case where Georgia and Alabama have 2 SEC losses and A&M's ahead of them with one loss, and they didn't play either of them. So maybe we haven't been talking about A&M enough. Maybe we haven't been talking about their schedule enough. I think we all expected Mizzou to be a tougher game for them. Maybe we expected LSU to be a tougher game for them, but that's sneaky. We should be talking about that more as a collective SEC media group.
I'm going to make a note of that so that maybe we can return to that on Tuesday. Now that a lot of these teams have played at least 2 conference games, maybe now is a good time to take a step back and be like, all right, what does this picture look like moving forward, especially with a lot of bigger games still coming down this month? The defensive performance, what maybe gives me cautious optimism, I suppose, is like maybe the phrase here, is that a lot of the mistakes, they were very sloppy. They were very undisciplined against Vanderbilt. And part of that is Vanderbilt's offense, putting them in compromising positions, and Alabama just not making the correct decisions more often than not. I think what maybe gives me a little bit of cautious optimism is that the sloppy, undisciplined nature of the way the defense performed, I feel like a lot of that is fixable, right? Like a handful of these penalties, like the illegal numbering, like that's just silly. You guys can get that fixed. That's a personnel thing. That's a communication thing. That's something that Kalen DeBoer even said afterwards, like, we just got to make sure everybody's on the same page, right? That should be a simple fix. The couple of other penalties, roughing the passer penalty that I know was kind of iffy, that was on the same drive that extended Vanderbilt after the illegal numbering. That was on a incomplete pass on 3rd down that I think would have probably limited them to a field goal try rather than a touchdown. That's a simple thing Q-Rob's got to know, like, hey, man, it may not have actually been roughing, quote unquote, but like, you can't put your hands on the quarterback's face, right? Like, that's a simple thing. Same thing with Jihad Campbell getting tagged with that face mask penalty. That's just a simple execution thing. Alabama ultimately had, I believe it was 9 total missed tackles in this game. That's according to Pro Football Focus. You look at the guys who missed the tackles: Jihad Campbell with 2, Quay Russaw with 1, LT Overton with 1, Tim Keenan with 1, Deontay Lawson with 1, Devonta Smith with 1, Jamarian Latham with 1. Like, that's just simple execution stuff. Wrap up and put them on the ground. You guys just, that's part of that. Also just might be like little extra effort / hustle, which give Vandy some credit, like give them a little bit of credit, but I like that should be simple execution, wrap up and bring them to the ground. If they do that, how many of those 3rd downs do they, convert? If they do that, how many of those 3rd down plays are even, like, how much harder are they? Right. Because 12 of 18 on third down for Vanderbilt. They went 0 for 3 when they had to convert 9 or more yards. Like that's, if you wrap up and bring them to the ground, is it third and long instead of third and manageable, right? Like little simple things like that. So a little bit of cautious optimism that just better execution overall and a little bit more disciplined play, whether that's stopping the option or just eliminating silly penalties like that, might help them. I don't know. The other thing that I thought was really interesting is the more I thought about the way Vanderbilt executed offensively, they used a ton of pre-snap motion. I was keeping track of it through the first couple of drives. We were sitting next to each other in the press box. I'm sure you heard me. Every time before pre-snap, I'd be like, pre-snap motion, pre-snap motion, pre-snap motion, right? Like a Jerry Kill staple. He's really, really good about dressing stuff up for what is actually really just a simple play. And it made me wonder, like, how frustrating was that for Alabama's defense? And even Q Robinson said afterwards, just like, yeah, like it makes things a little bit harder. And especially when you consider this is where like the whole vision based defensive coverage that Alabama is now running, as opposed to the pattern match stuff under Nick Saban. I just wonder if there's a lot of eye candy when they're doing pre-snap motion and stuff. And especially when it comes to the option offense that they run, there's just a lot of guys moving in a lot of different directions. There's a lot of different flow. And rather than worrying about whoever your guy is on that play, they have this vision-based mindset now where it's like, we're just going to keep eyes on everything and everybody. And it made them lose track of stuff, right? Like those 2 shovel pass plays. Those were brilliant play calls that took advantage of Alabama flowing way too far one way. And then boom, there's a hole 30 yards down the field. Same thing with a lot of the option runs. Like I know 3 yards a carry isn't really imposing, so to speak, but like they still had 4 or 5 runs of 10 plus yards. And when they needed to convert, second down, third down, Pavia was able to keep it and muscle his way through. The missed tackles, I think, played a role in that as well. Like I just wonder, I don't know that they're going to face an offense that has as much option-based stuff as Vanderbilt does the rest of the way. But you look at the rest of Alabama's schedule, they play South Carolina next week. Lenora Sellers may not be the true dual threat guy, but he's mobile and he is able to run. And he's also just a really big body, right? Tennessee, Nico Iamaleava may not be a run first type of quarterback, but he is mobile enough that he can do that. And also, oh, by the way, like that's another offense that does a lot of pre-snap motion stuff to set up their run game. And that's really what Tennessee has been very, very good about. They still got to play Auburn. We know what Hugh Freeze does with that motion-based run offense stuff that really kind of messes with your eyes as a defender. They're going to face tests like this moving forward. And I just wonder, can they handle it? Can they fix it? Can they make adjustments? There's a lot of stuff I think about this defense that has us worried over the last 5 or 6 quarters, maybe even 7, if you want to go all the way back to the second quarter of the Georgia game. I feel like I'm just kind of puking out another soliloquy. What has you the most worried, Mike, about Alabama's defense moving forward? If you had to pick a certain area, a certain group of players, a certain position group, like who do you want to see fix their stuff first?
3 runs of 10 yards or more is what Vandy had. 12, 12, 13. 6 passes of 15 yards or more. 17, 31 to 36 yards on 4th and 1 to touchdown. 33, 20, and 19.
2 of those, the two of those were the shovel passes, and then that 36-yarder was on that 4th and 1.
All out of those looks where they're out on the run. There's different levels to it. There's lock on the backfield. Like we've heard it all offseason, like how simpler this defense would be. And I think LT Overton at one point mentioned, and I have some of these quotes filed away because I think it's potentially worth a story at some point here, but like how the playbook went from this to this.
Yeah.
And, a lot of players were happy about that. That it was needlessly complicated under Nick Saban. It had grown too thick. Players didn't know what was happening in the Tennessee game 2 years ago. And pattern match was hard to learn. And, a lot of the players were happy that this gave them more freedom. That's something Jamarian Latham, I can imagine him talking about at one point. A couple other players have talked about it. And you see Kane Womack even out there calling plays with,
No, it's a note card.
It's like a note card. It's like the size of my phone. And you don't want to boil it down to something, as simple as that. Like, is the defense too simple? I think there was always that threat of that question coming up. Did the pendulum swing too far in the other direction? Does this defense work? I'm not talking about the formation. Like, I think people are too fixated on the 4-2-5, but just the overall philosophy on defense. Does it work at this level? And I think it did for a quarter against Georgia. I think the results through the last 3 quarters against Georgia were pretty bad. And now you have this Vandy game. I can go back and, recite all of it again, but, I wouldn't necessarily run victory laps for Kane Wommack's defense in the SEC quite yet, because it's a tough league with a lot of smart offensive minds and a lot of coaches that are going to adjust. And if you have something that is too simple that you think might be able to cover every scenario, and you just, there's a very kind of simple call structure, then maybe there's a certain humility that, will be learned from that. So, I try not to dumb it down too much to that. Like, I don't want to make it that simple, but there probably is something to that the pendulum has swung too far in the other direction, and they need to make sure they're running a defense that's able to adjust and have answers for different complications that are thrown their way, because you need your players to be in the best spot to be successful. And I think there are some plays in that game where they weren't. And I think there are some plays in that game where the players just got outmanned and out physical and got run through. So it's always a mix. And I don't want to just focus on one thing, but I do think that's part of the equation here.
Be very curious to see what Kane says on Monday when we get an opportunity to talk to him. That was a lot on the defense. I know we don't have to spend probably too much time on the offense, but I am curious just the offensive performance overall from Alabama. I thought generally they played pretty well. They just really weren't on the field all that often. They put up 396 total yards of offense. Jalen Milroe, 19 of 25, 312 yards and a touchdown. First time in his college career, back-to-back 300-yard passing games. I thought that was pretty cool. He's also completed, I believe it's north of 70% of his passes in 4 of the first 5 games this season. Just continues to play very well. Also had a rushing touchdown. The offense, they're not at fault for this. That's at least my takeaway from the offensive performance. I don't know that they got a ton of opportunities. I will say, though, there were 2 possessions in the second half where Alabama got the ball back with an opportunity to either tie or take the lead. And both of those instances, the offense did not come through. It was 23-21 early in the third quarter. They went 3 and out in part because of the illegal forward pass penalty on Jalen Milroe. It eliminated what would have been a 50-yard bomb to Jeremy Bernard down the field. The next one, 33-28, when they got the ball back, that was when Milroe got sacked and they fumbled the ball away. So, and that was after 2 plays that moved him about 40 yards down the field. So they were moving it, and then Elijah Pritchett gets beat, Milroe fumbles the ball. And so good as the offense was, the couple of opportunities that they did have, they did not come through. And I think that kind of speaks overall to a game like this when the defense isn't on their P's and Q's like that. I'm not saying the offense has to be perfect, because I don't know that the time of possession battle is going to be as lopsided as this the next time they're in a dogfight like this. But in this particular situation, at those points in the game, the offense kind of had to be perfect. And as good as they were not.
It's not the defense's fault that Milroe threw a pick 6. It's marginally Milroe's fault that he threw the pick 6. I think you can maybe question the decision to throw that into contested coverage.
He owned it afterwards, too. He said he either needs to put the ball placement somewhere else so that the DB can't deflect it up in the air like it did, or he just needs to run through his reads a little bit quicker.
Right. And it feels like 95 times out of 100, that ball just gets deflected down to the ground. I mean, the physics on that were insane, like how high it got in the air, and then you could see the safety coming in. It was a perfect storm against Alabama.
Yeah.
But it's not completely blameless for Milroe. And obviously it's not the defense's fault. And then it's not the defense's fault when Elijah Pritchett gets beat. An underrated play in the game to me that people, we're ripping and shredding and talking about the offensive line for the first couple weeks of the season. And the offensive line didn't have the best day, I would say, against Vandy. I mean, rushing
they weren't bad, but they weren't great.
Right. And that was one of 2 sacks for Milroe. There was another one, 2nd and 10 in the second quarter. Milroe took a 3-yard sack, and then the next pass was the one to Ryan Williams that got overturned. That was a 3 and out. So 2 sacks they gave up. Running game wise, this was obviously a game where Alabama was playing from behind, so you're probably not expecting a ton of rushing. But 6 carries for Justice Haynes. Another game where just things did not go his way, game script wise. And
you could tell early that they were maybe trying to get him involved a little bit, because he had a handful of those early runs. He also caught 2 passes for 17 yards. Like, they were doing, I don't know if that was the central focus of the game plan, but they were doing their damnedest to get him the ball in space, and he was making it work for the most part.
Right. 3 of his 6 carries came on that first drive within a minute of each other in the first quarter. He had 2 in the second quarter, 1 in the third quarter, none in the fourth quarter. So basically was taken out of the game, if you will, the game plan. Jam Miller was more effective. 5 carries, 45 yards, but 5 carries for Jam Miller. Like,
I will say, I guess we don't know for sure if Justice was supposed to be a big part of the game plan, but he did play 29 snaps to Jam's 18. I know that they had only played 45 snaps total, and I think there were at least a few where they were both on the field together. But
yeah, and you only threw 25 times. Again, it's just one of those games, and this wasn't because they were marching up and down the field quickly. I mean, they had the one long touchdown with Ryan Williams. They didn't run a ton of plays, 46 plays to Vandy's 75, and they averaged 8.6 yards a play. I think Miller did a pretty good job of distributing the ball, finding some different receivers. 3 of 7 on third down was okay. And, they had the really good play call on, was it 4th and 1 at the goal line, the Ryan Williams end around.
Yeah, the Roma Dunze play. That was really cool.
Yeah,
I don't know if you remember seeing that last year watching Washington.
Apple Cup, yeah.
Yeah.
But Milroe was not really effective as a runner outside of that touchdown run. I don't think the offense is blameless. I think certainly the Pritchett strip sack is a huge deal in that game, that you were driving the ball down the field. I think the sort of the vibe of the game would have been different if Alabama had scored there. So that's a big deal. And it's still an offense that feels like it needs that Ryan Williams big play. And that's problematic for the game when it just doesn't happen. It's not there. And, you did get the big play down the sideline from Bernard. You were able to get Dupree down the seam a couple times. You don't want the offense to be, too dependent on Ryan Williams, but at the same time, like, you need to use him because he's Ryan Williams. So, yeah, there's a balance there. But I do feel like if Ryan Williams doesn't make a huge play down the field, what is this offense exactly? And it's a much different offense. And if there's an injury, not to him, if it is to him, but even somebody else, it's like this team has been very healthy. You had the Prentice injury, you had the Kendrick Law injury. I don't feel like those are crippling to the offense, but it doesn't feel, something still feels off about it to me. And it's not statistically bad at all. I mean, efficiency wise, I think they're 12th right now in ESPN's offensive efficiency stat. And
They've been good.
And the defense is 13th, by the way, 13th in the country.
That's surprising, but okay.
Special teams is 63rd. So
that's not very special.
And Graham Nicholson, I mean, the loneliest person on the planet. Like they don't kick any field goals. Like all they do is score touchdowns when they get close. It's incredible. There's still questions about the offense to me. So I don't think they're totally blameless in this game, but obviously it's kind of like the crowd. Like a large proportion of the crowd is Alabama fans, and a large proportion of the blame falls on Alabama's defense. And remember, the key to any football game is turnovers. And when everybody asks you about what's the key to the game, say turnovers, and you're always right. And in this game, you had 2 turnovers by the offense. One of them was, again, fluky-ish, but it ended up in 6 points. And then you had the Elijah Pritchett strip sack, which also resulted in a Vandy touchdown. So that's 14 points off of Alabama offensive turnovers.
Yeah, and there was almost a third turnover, right? When Emmanuel Henderson was returning the kickoff, and what was originally ruled a fumble was ultimately ruled down on review because his elbow hit before the ball came out. So that's just, when I think about sloppy, undisciplined play, the turnovers obviously play a role in that. You can't lose a turnover battle, especially in a game as tight as this.
Right, and the defense didn't force any turnovers, and again, I would lean in terms of blame closer to 75-25 to me. I think the offense deserves at least a quarter of the blame. So we'll divide the pie as we do there.
I think that's fair. Usually we do play the game and game MVP, but we're already closing in on 50-minute conversation here. I am curious, Mike, there's a lot of questions going forward about this Alabama team. What's maybe the first one or the most important one that kind of comes to your mind?
How the locker room handles all of this, I think is always a question when you have a loss. And it's one of those things you're never going to hear about in the moment. It's one of those things you tend to hear about months, years later, about how things kind of went down. And you have a situation where there's some different reactions. Like you have Malachi Moore's reaction, you have Tyler Booker's reaction. There's different ways of handling this. You have Kalen DeBoer's way of handling it. You have kind of the Nick Saban way of handling it. there's different ways to skin the cat when you have a loss like this. And how does that all work? You know, I go back to something Nick Saban said at SEC Media Days, which was how successful this team is early. And I think this still qualifies as early in the season, is important to kind of keeping guys on board with Kalen DeBoer. And I'm not suggesting, as you know, happened in New England this week, there's somebody who suggested there was a mutiny in the locker room. I'm not saying anything like that. I'm just saying I think Nick Saban's probably on something there in terms of what he said in July. Like, you know, you want to make sure everybody's still rowing the boat in the same direction. And when you have a loss and you have people reacting in different ways, and sometimes fingers get pointed in the locker room, and, you know, they, in Tyler Booker's words, need to stay together. And I think that's what Booker relayed from DeBoer's message to the team, which was you can't have players disperse, which was the word that Booker used, and that they need to stay together. So if that's something that DeBoer is saying to the team is important, then I will also echo that myself, that it is something that is not guaranteed in this situation.
I think that's fair. That's kind of related / is my big question moving forward, is how do you respond to this, right? You got a South Carolina team that's coming in that's maybe got some dangerous qualities or dangerous traits about them. They tend to play pretty hard. They thumped Kentucky pretty good, and we saw what Kentucky did to Ole Miss. So maybe there's, I don't know, maybe it's just one of those weird seasons where there's a little bit more parity in the SEC. I think that'll bear out over the next month or two. But they got a big quarterback who Beamer is not afraid to run the ball. Can the defense show that they can stop an offense that is capable of doing that? Can the secondary continue to improve? Last week it was the corners. This week I would argue it was a little bit more of the safeties. Can those guys come together? We know that there's a lot of talent there. I'd like to see it. Yeah, I just overall response. Like, how do they approach this upcoming week? How do they, you know, the season may not be on the brink in the same way as it was last year after the loss to Texas, but given everything that we saw around the country last week, like, you know, you kind of have to keep your head on a swivel and buckle down and win these games that you're supposed to win, basically keep all of your goals and everything still in front of you. I don't know that 2 losses completely shatters their season either, whether that second loss comes next week or to Tennessee or somewhere else down the line.
I'll stop you there. If it comes to South Carolina, that's bad. I think that's very bad from you have 2 bad losses on your resume standpoint. If it comes to Tennessee, again, a better loss is what you kind of want. So I think Alabama losing to Vandy and South Carolina would be damn near crippling to their playoff hopes.
Well, and at that point, if they lose to South Carolina at home after losing to Vanderbilt, I think there's a lot larger issues here, and we may not even have to worry about the playoff at that point. We would have to be worried about a lot of other things. So something else to keep in mind. But yes, I'm very curious what the response is going to be, how they approach this next week, how they come out playing against South Carolina, another team that they are going to be handily favored against, and a team that they probably should beat. So same as what Vanderbilt was this past week. I will leave the podcast with one thought that I had as I was driving back home, the final leg from Birmingham to Tuscaloosa. Kalen DeBoer's first year at Washington, 2022, that team started 4-0, and then they lost back-to-back games late September, early October, one to UCLA, 40-32, another one, 45-38, to an Arizona State team that finished that 2022 season 1-7 in the Pac-12 schedule. Believe they only won 2 or 3 games total that entire season. I think that was near the end of the Herm Edwards tenure. That was a game that Washington probably should not have lost. There was some fluky things I think that also happened in that game. They had a quarterback. Arizona State played really, really hot. Sun Devils took an interception back early in the game for a touchdown, ultimately won by a possession. Not unlike what happened on Saturday in Nashville between Alabama and Vanderbilt. That Washington team responded by winning out the rest of that season, capped off with a bowl win over Texas. And then that program did not lose again until they got to last year's national championship game. I'm not saying that that's what Alabama is going to do in response to this, but DeBoer has a little bit of a history of dealing with what looks like a very ugly loss on paper and getting his team back in the right frame of mind to then finish out the season the way that they probably wanted to. So we'll see if he can do that again this upcoming week, but I did find that parallel a little bit interesting. We'll see if they can bounce back in the same way. That's all we've got today, guys. We'll be back Tuesday after we talk to the coordinators, hopefully gain a little bit more insights. I think we're also, at least I am, I don't know about Mike and Alex, probably going to rewatch the game to see if we can learn a little bit more about what Vanderbilt was able to do, what Alabama was not able to do in this game. We'll circle back on Tuesday to discuss what we learned, what we saw, maybe even take a big picture look at the SEC at large now that everybody's played a couple of conference games. In the meantime, though, be sure to rate and review this show wherever you listen to your podcast, Apple, Stitcher, Spotify, even our Bama 247 YouTube page. Subscribe to Bama 247 and 24/7 Sports. It's been a pretty hectic couple of days on our website, but we've got everything covered from Saturday night through Sunday, and we're going to continue to provide you guys coverage, win or lose, of this Alabama team this season. So come along and enjoy the ride. As always, we appreciate you guys for listening. We'll talk to you all again soon.